And now, during the interval of the concert, we present Painting of the Month. Here is the third of this year's series of monthly talks in which a speaker discusses a picture that interests him personally. This afternoon's speaker is David Talbot Rice, Watson Gordon Professor of the History of Fine Art at the University of Edinburgh. He's chosen to talk about the adoration of the name of Jesus, sometimes called The Dream of Philip II by Greco, which is to be seen in the National Gallery, London. Professor Talbot Rice.
El Greco's picture, The Adoration of the Name of Jesus, or as it's sometimes called, The Dream of Philip II, is a variant of a much larger painting of the same subject which was done for Philip II of Spain. This larger version is now in the Escurial, that strange forbidding palace, built by Philip between 1563 and 1584 in the mountains 30 miles to the west of Madrid. There he lived through all the latter part of his life, confined to his bed in a suite of minute rooms. From the bed he could overlook the high altar of the palace church, while from his study he had a clear view over the plain to his new capital, Madrid. It was probably to the Escurial that Greco went to do his first work for the king. It was from there that he was dismissed a year or so later, after painting the large and magnificent martyrdom of St. Maurice. This was intended for the high altar, but it failed to please, and was demoted to a dark corner in the sacristy, where it's remained semi-visible ever since. Philip's favourite painter was the 15th century Fleming Jerome, or as he's sometimes called, Hieronymus Bosch, whose strange, fantastic medievalism and precise, minute style both seem to have had a strange appeal for him. It's perhaps not surprising that Greco's profoundly philosophical and transcendental outlook, his wild, sweeping style, and his symbolic colouring were less acceptable. Yet there was much about the adoration that must have appealed to Philip, for the mouth of hell in the right foreground and the scene of a cave or hall with people hanging in it in the centre are both medieval in spirit and have something of the fantasy of Bosch about them. Probably the first thing you'd notice about the adoration in the Spanish room in the National Gallery is the way it stands out because of its colour. It has a strange, unearthly pink glow about it, in some ways similar to the pink of Bosch's Garden of Delights, which was also in Philip's possession. But the rendering and conception of the picture are quite different. Bosch was a narrative painter, and his work is important for its subject matter. Greco's art is essentially interpretational, and he seeks to express the profundity of his emotions by form and colour rather than by direct representation. Indeed, how else could he have treated a subject as abstract as the adoration of the name of Jesus? Representation of a straightforward character is nevertheless there, as it is in all Greco's work. He could paint nature as realistically as anyone, and in our picture you will find realism in the cross at the top or in the details of many of the figures. But the dominating emotion is ecstasy, and the profundity of his ecstatic approach is expressed in every shape, every angle, every colour relationship. In the foreground kneel two figures. The one on the left is probably the Doge of Venice in a mantle of strange buff colour. That on the right is Philip himself, in black with a white ruff and black gloves, kneeling at a curious angle on a gold cushion. In painting his long, pale face and his strange, angular legs, Greco seems to have penetrated to the very depth of the character of this unusual individual, who ruled half the world from a bed of sickness in the Escurial. Between them, and facing the spectator, is the Pope. Behind Philip, in the lowest plane of the picture, the great maw of hell stands open, swallowing up the damned and ready, almost, to swallow up the spectator as well in its daring frontal position. It's black, with huge white teeth and pink gums, and within is a mass of tortured naked figures. Beside the Pope, facing the spectator, are two figures, the first with a white surplice and greenish buff cope above it, the second a cardinal in red. These perhaps represent the Cardinals Granville and Francesco di Pacheco. Behind them is a seething mass of heads, leading the way to another group, led by a strange figure in red, with arms upraised. He is perhaps Don John of Austria, Philip's half-brother. Between this group and the mouth of hell, a vast hall or cave is suggested rather than depicted, with figures in grey on what's apparently a bridge, almost silhouetted against the purple, pink and red flames behind the mouth of hell itself, and with figures apparently hanging within it. It's another instance of medieval symbolism, the bridge being the passage to purgatory, which the good pass over while the wicked fall into the abyss. At the top of the picture, the Jesuit emblem in the form of the letters IHS, a cross rising from the horizontal bar of the H, stands out against the traditional medieval mandorla, or, if one may call it, brilliance of glory, the colour of the pale sun on an early midsummer morning. Crowds of angels were around in adoration, and they and the clouds on which they are poised seem to reflect an unworldly glow of heavenly brilliance, which is made the more striking by the heavy grey of the clouds on either side. They would seem ominous if they didn't serve to intensify the glory of the central composition, and if they were not offset by the brilliant purple-red robes of two of the angels that rest on them on either side. Below the cloud to the spectator's left, the buff and green robes and parts of the legs of two angels are seen, their bodies wholly obscured by the cloud. Who but Greco would have dared to paint them like that? At the bottom, to the left-hand corner, is an inscription in Greek. Domenikos Theotokopoulos Chris epoi. Domenikos Theotokopoulos, the Cretan, did it. The whole conception of the picture is strange and unexpected. The colouring is forceful, daring and unusual, and it's a brilliant piece of painting, which would be at home beside the work of a Chagall or a Graham Sutherland today. But surpassing that of mid-and-modern works is the sense of form, as well as the way in which the figures are painted. Their great muscular arms and Olympic legs reflect the works of Michelangelo and form a curious contrast with the puny yet characterful figure of Philip. There has been a good deal of discussion as to the reasons why the picture was painted. The Jesuits were powerful, and the theme of the adoration of the name of Jesus was normal enough. But why hell below? And why the figures of the Pope and Philip and the Doge of Venice? Professor Sir Anthony Blunt, in a study of the Escurial version of this picture, proposes that it was done to commemorate the Triple Alliance of Spain, Venice and Rome against the Turks, which culminated in the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. This serves to explain the three figures. It would also explain the presence of Don John, the victor of the battle. The cross and the symbol IHS would signalize the victory, and at the same time attest the triumph of Christendom. Hell is there to call to mind the fate awaiting the infidel, and the glorification above attributes the victory to divine providence. This is a very probable explanation, and no one, surely, would wish to dispute it today. But the basic conception of the composition of the adoration, and this is true both of the Escurial and the National Gallery versions, this is a rather different origin. It must have been suggested to Greco by the common medieval theme of the Last Judgment. Details such as the mouth of hell and the choirs of angels, the holy men and the holy women, were taken almost directly from the medieval world, where the theme of the Last Judgment was a very usual one. This is so not only in Gothic art, but also in Romanesque and later Byzantine. There's a rendering in the refectory of the monastery of the Lavra on Mount Athos in Greece, which is very similar in its arrangement, though the mouth of hell is there set sideways. Its frontal position in the adoration serves to attest Greco's greater skill and daring. The Lavra painting is a work of the so-called Cretan school of Byzantine art. Wall paintings that were very like it were no doubt seen by Greco in his native island of Crete, when he lived there as a youth before he went to Venice. Similarly, though less obviously, the unnaturally obtuse angle of Philip's knees and the position of his hands go back to Byzantine prototypes. The habit of poising angels on clouds was also usual in Byzantine art. It's true that angels on clouds appear often enough elsewhere, but only in Byzantine art do we see just the same curious framing of a single group on a single cloud. The treatment seems at the same time to attest the otherworldly character of the figures, to make them a vital part of the composition. Greco, incidentally, made use of clouds in much the same way on more than one occasion. For instance, in one of his views of Toledo, which is now in that city, the Tavera hospital has been wafted on a cloud from its natural sitting, where it was not visible from the painter's standpoint, to a place in the forefront of the painting, where it plays a prominent part in the picture. Mannerisms like this have often been considered, quite wrongly, as Greco's personal idiosyncrasies. The real explanation is to be found in the painter's Byzantine background. For Byzantine art, indeed the whole of Byzantine thought, was governed by an unworldly, transcendental outlook and a dominating belief in the miraculous. Man was there on earth, and his form provided the subject matter of art. But art was not, to the Byzantine mind, bound by earthly considerations, for it sought to escape them and express the infinite. When Goldscheider wrote about the adoration of the name of Jesus just before the war, he said, "This picture can only be understood as a reflection of the shadowy light, the iridescent color, the incoherent flash of details, and the convincing improbabilities of a dream." But there are hundreds of similar instances in the story of Byzantine art where dreams had no part to play at all. Goldscheider was surely forgetting that Greco had been nourished not in a Western, but in an Eastern tradition. It's there that part at least of Greco's heritage is to be found. There too the strange elongated figures which he so favoured appear time and time again throughout the centuries. There is virtually no Byzantine painting on a large scale to be seen in this country. But the miniatures used to decorate the manuscripts of Gospels in the British Museum or the Bodleian Library at Oxford serve to give some idea. And if you look at a reproduction of any Byzantine nativity, there's one from the monastery of Xenophontos in the black and white illustrations that go with this talk, and you can find others in Grabar's Byzantine painting or my own Art of Byzantium, then you'll be able to trace just the same unworldly colouring, the same outlook, and often the same iconography that is evident in Greco, though the style of his work is, of course, quite distinct. Many others have failed to appreciate that Greco's work had a long line of predecessors so far as iconography and understanding were concerned. This is true of Paul Guinard, when he says that the Sinai landscape, which forms a part of the lovely triptych by Greco, now at Modena, answers to a fantastic, or anyhow surreal conception of landscape. The painting is the forerunner of much that we see in the works of many of our present-day painters. But it also follows an age-old tradition in Byzantine art, as we see it in renderings of the Transfiguration scene, to which Greco turned when he painted the triptych, presumably soon after his arrival in Italy. Artists have, throughout the ages, always borrowed from the past. The study of art is not concerned with isolated manifestations, however brilliant, but rather with a series of interlinked developments, where every link is connected in a continuous chain, though the links vary in shape and size, sometimes being numerous and short, sometimes large and embracing lengthy periods. Greco is no exception to this rule. There are links that bind him to Italy, and he learnt much from Tintoretto and Bassano and Titian. There are links that bind him to Michelangelo, whose work he must have seen in Rome, though he didn't admire it, "A nice man, Michelangelo," he said, "but he can't paint." But of all the links, that which binds Greco to the Byzantine world is probably the most important, and it seems to have acted with renewed force when once he had become established in Spain. The strange formal shapes of mountains or clouds, the setting of figures against a sort of foil or reflex, the posing of figures as if levitated, are all Byzantine mannerisms, and many of the actual compositions follow Byzantine iconographical prototypes. And his habit of signing in Greek with the special formula, Domenikos the Cretan did it, was again derived from one usual among Greek icon painters of the age. Indeed, the very essence of his being was Byzantine, though in his personal genius he stepped right outside the Byzantine frame. And what of his influence on the painters that followed? What heritage did Greco leave? Velázquez, in some of his work, undoubtedly owed a debt to him. And the link is obvious, but it was not lasting. Velázquez, when he found himself, or rather perhaps when his role was finally cast for him in the court of Philip IV, changed to a more mundane and matter-of-fact approach. But then there was a gap, for it wasn't until the 20th century that what may be termed interpretational painting began to be lived once more, and men like Gauguin and Cézanne, Chagall or Graham Sutherland took it up where Greco had left it. These men and others were to become the great masters of interpretation, as opposed to Rembrandt or Reynolds, Claude or Constable, who were still essentially masters of representation. And to explain what I mean by this term interpretation, I can't do better than quote a passage from a book in which I was associated a good many years ago now with my friend Robert Barron, a great critic and a very fine writer, who, pondering his writer's ambitions as he walked the encircling hills of Toledo, wrote that he suddenly knew that Greco had taught him, as no other man had ever done, what can be made of the symbols of human understanding. The instruments of language and colour, of grammar and brush, became suddenly inseparable. Only the purpose of art was apparent, to express through beauty the purpose of man. It seemed for one transient moment as though not only any artist, but any human being whatsoever, engaged in any high aim, might model his work on Greco's. The illusion passed, but there remained a new and deeper knowledge of that single quest which is at the bottom of all true art and thought. Greco is not an easy artist to understand. He forsook pure naturalism. He made use of strange, imaginative shapes and of even stranger colouring. His art depended little on representation, and the proportion of his figures was not of this world. There's a visionary quality, an otherworldly beauty, and a strange profundity about his pictures that is rare to find. The adoration of the name of Jesus, perhaps more than any other of his works, sets him apart from his contemporaries. It represents the very quintessence of his style. Our version of it in London may be smaller than that at the Escurial, but it's no less brilliant. It is one of our very great national treasures, and we are lucky to have it.
That recorded talk by Professor Talbot Rice was the third in this year's series